It all begins with the last verifiable moment in which Eliza was seen alive, leaving a hotel in Rio de Janeiro with her baby in her arms and stepping into a car driven by Macaro and Bruno's teenage cousin. From that point on, everything about her fate becomes wrapped in shadows, because no one outside Bruno's inner circle ever saw her again. The investigation quickly transformed into a spectacle, one where the disappearance of a young mother collided with the fame of a national football star, creating an immediate wave of attention that was less concerned with uncovering the truth and more focused on feeding a growing storm of sensationalism. As the media rushed to produce headlines, the story spiraled into something far larger than the evidence behind it. What should have been a meticulous investigation became instead a constant parade of speculation. Each day brought new rumors, theories, and grotesque narratives that spread faster than verification could contain them. Wild claims involving animals, concrete, and bizarre scenarios appeared in front of cameras and in the mouths of commentators who treated unconfirmed stories as near-certain fact. The emotional climate made it easy for conjecture to masquerade as evidence, creating a distorted atmosphere that overshadowed the fragile reality at the core of the case. The more the story grew, the more distant the truth became. The absence of physical evidence only intensified the instability of the investigation. Without material proof, without witnesses outside the group, and without any verifiable trace of Eliza after the hotel, authorities leaned heavily on the fragile narratives presented by people who were themselves entangled in suspicion. The lack of external confirmation created a vacuum in which the loudest version of events became the most accepted, regardless of inconsistencies or contradictions. Analysts later noted that such reliance on testimony without verification made the entire structure of the case precarious from the beginning. Meanwhile, Eliza's earlier attempts to seek help, specifically after being assaulted by Macaron while pregnant, had been dismissed by a judge who claimed her relationship with Bruno did not qualify for protection. This refusal left her vulnerable, unprotected, and exposed to further danger. Analysts would later argue that this decision marked the first and perhaps most consequential institutional failure, as it removed the one layer of protection that could have changed everything. Instead, her cry for help was minimized, setting the stage for the tragic and unresolved disappearance that followed. As the investigation progressed, the timeline presented by Bruno's Circle portrayed Eliza's final days as calm, uneventful, and voluntary. They claimed she spent time at the property in Minas Gerais, nursing her baby and moving freely, but none of these details were supported by external witnesses. The absence of corroboration left every claim suspended in uncertainty, while contradictory details slipped past without scrutiny. The tension grew as analysts realized that the story relied entirely on accounts from people whose credibility was compromised by their proximity to the event. From the outset, the case was shaped more by narrative momentum than by factual clarity. In a setting where evidence failed to appear, where witnesses contradicted themselves, and where the truth rested behind the voices of those with most to lose, the disappearance of Eliza became a haunting mystery. Her final moments, obscured by silence and speculation, became the first shadow in a story that would unravel into one of the most controversial investigations in Brazilian criminal history. From the moment the group left Rio de Janeiro and began the long journey toward Minas Gerais, the trail of verifiable information about Eliza vanished. The road was long, filled with gas stations, rest stops, and simple opportunities for her presence to be noticed. Yet not a single independent witness ever reported seeing her. The fact that Bruno was an easily recognizable public figure only deepened the mystery. Analysts found it troubling that a trip involving a famous athlete, a young mother, and a baby could pass through such populated areas without anyone noticing anything unusual. This absence created a void too wide to ignore. According to the accounts given by Bruno's Circle, the trip proceeded without incident. They said Eliza appeared calm, cooperative, and willing to go to Minas to resolve the DNA dispute regarding her child. But with no external confirmation, the truth of these claims remains suspended in uncertainty. Analysts noted that when the only available narrative comes from individuals who later become suspects, every detail must be examined with caution. Instead, the investigation accepted these statements with an ease that felt unsettling, especially given the stakes of the situation. Upon arriving at the property, the witness accounts became even murkier. Workers claimed she stayed at the house, fed her child, and walked freely around the premises, yet their statements lacked consistency, detail, or independent verification. Some parts of their recollections contradicted others, and none could provide a reliable chain of events. Analysts questioned why a woman who had previously sought legal protection from violence would willingly isolate herself in a rural property with people connected to those she feared, a point that investigators seemed to overlook. The turning point in the narrative came when Bruno's associates claimed that Eliza left the property with Macaro and the cousin to go for a drive and never returned. The casual tone with which her absence was treated became one of the most disturbing elements of the story. No one at the property sounded an alarm, and no one contacted authorities or family members. This indifference raised the possibility that those present already knew she would not be coming back, though no testimony admitted such foreknowledge. The silence surrounding her disappearance echoed louder than the words used to explain it. The handling of her baby reinforced that sense of something terribly wrong. The child supposedly returned to the property without his mother, yet no one acted with urgency or concern. Instead, the baby was cared for by the same individuals who had taken Eliza away, in a scenario that analysts described as chilling. Later, the child was passed to unrelated third parties in Minas, an act that raised more questions about intent and motive. The movement of the baby became a shadowed trail that revealed more about the adult's behavior than their words ever did. As each piece of the timeline unfolded, the inconsistencies, silences, and contradictions formed a mosaic of doubt. Without external witnesses, without physical evidence, and without coherent testimony, the story relied on fragile threads that failed to tie together into a clear truth. What remained was an unsettling portrait of a disappearance treated with indifference by those present, and an investigation unable to illuminate the darkness surrounding Eliza's final moments. The moment the name Bola entered the narrative, the case shifted into even deeper uncertainty. His involvement was never established by physical evidence, only by the unstable and conflicting testimony of Bruno's teenage cousin. The boy changed his version multiple times, adding dramatic and grotesque details that analysts later recognized as biologically impossible or inconsistent with forensic science. Yet despite the contradictions, investigators treated his shifting accounts as foundational, leaning heavily on his words to construct the most sensational part of the narrative. The single verifiable link between Bola and the case was one brief phone call between him and Macaro on the day of the alleged crime. Analysts repeatedly emphasized that a single call, without context, without further contact, and without any physical evidence, could not legitimately establish involvement. Even so, the investigation built an entire chain of assumptions around that call, transforming it into the cornerstone of a theory that lacked material proof. The leap from a call to a homicide narrative became one of the most widely criticized aspects of the case. When forensic teams searched Bola's property, they found nothing: no blood, no tissue, no clothing, no evidence of violence. Analysts pointed out that a homicide as violent as the one alleged would inevitably leave behind biological traces detectable through modern forensic methods. Yet despite extensive searching, including excavation and chemical testing, every analysis returned negative. This absence of physical proof should have undermined the allegations, but the narrative had already begun to outrun the evidence, fueled by public expectation and media dramatization. The inconsistencies in the cousin's testimony grew increasingly alarming. He described events that defied basic logic and physical possibility, yet investigators continued to treat his words as credible. Analysts later noted that his age, emotional state, and potential influence from adults involved in the case should have been considered carefully. Instead, the investigation seemed to accept each new version as long as it supported the central narrative, further widening the distance between procedural rigor and storytelling. Throughout the process, Bola maintained his innocence, stating repeatedly that he had no involvement with Eliza or Bruno. His refusal to confess or reveal a location for a supposed body was used against him, even though, as analysts explained, it is impossible to reveal information you do not possess. The prosecution's insistence on framing his silence as guilt rather than lack of knowledge highlighted how fixed the narrative had become, regardless of the absence of evidence. As the story grew, Bola became a character molded by the investigation's need for a villain who could explain the parts of the narrative unsupported by forensic fact. His image was shaped not by material proof, but by the cumulative effect of testimonies, speculation, and dramatized reenactment. Analysts later reflected that his insertion into the case revealed more about the investigation's shortcomings than about the truth of what happened to Eliza. The reliance on a fragile narrative, unsupported by physical evidence, became one of the most controversial decisions in the entire case. The absence of forensic evidence became an increasingly central issue as the investigation unfolded. Teams searched Bruno's property, dismantling walls, digging through soil, and testing every possible stain for biological traces belonging to Eliza, yet nothing was found. Analysts pointed out that a crime as violent as the one described would have left behind undeniable physical remnant, even after attempts to clean or conceal them. The total lack of material proof left investigators relying almost exclusively on testimony, which in this case was inconsistent and compromised. The claims that Eliza had been confined or mistreated inside the property also lacked physical corroboration. Analysts expected to find indications of restraint, damage, or blood in the areas where she was allegedly held, but no such evidence existed. The room where she was supposedly kept showed no signs of struggle or confinement. Household items tested negative for her DNA. If she had been injured there, the environment would have reflected it. Yet every test contradicted the narrative presented by the witness. Even the vehicle used to transport her failed to provide conclusive evidence. Small traces of blood were found, but none were confirmed to be hers, and their quantity was far too small to support the theory of serious violence. Analysts stressed that in homicide cases involving physical force, vehicles almost always contain detectable biological traces, even after cleaning. The absence of such evidence in this case further weakened the alleged sequence of events. The prosecution's theories relied heavily on reenactments and assumptions rather than scientific finding. Analysts noted that forensic science should have guided the investigation, but instead it was overshadowed by emotionally charged testimony and media pressure. Each time forensic analysis contradicted the narrative, investigators seemed to pivot toward new theories rather than reassessing the credibility of their assumptions. This approach created an unstable investigative structure that analysts later criticized for lacking rigorous methodology. Despite the lack of physical proof, the investigation continued to promote a version of events that described a brutal and coordinated crime. Analysts questioned how such violence could occur without leaving behind DNA, fabric fibers, footprints, or signs of struggle. Yet the case moved forward as though the absence of evidence itself were insignificant, reinforcing a narrative unsupported by forensic data. Over time, the gap between the brutality described in testimony and the emptiness of the forensic findings became one of the most disturbing contradictions in the case. The lack of physical evidence not only undermined the narrative, but also cast a long shadow over the investigative process. Analysts argued that this void should have prompted deeper reevaluation, but instead it became a silent foundation upon which the prosecution built its case, leaving behind unanswered questions that continue to haunt the story. The issuance of Eliza's death certificate became one of the most controversial moments in the entire case, as it declared her dead without the presence of a body and assigned a cause of death without any forensic examination. Analysts emphasized that such a certificate should only be issued when death is proven or established through a formal and rigorous legal process, neither of which occurred here. The judge who signed the document specified asphyxiation as the cause of death, despite the complete absence of scientific evidence, raising immediate concerns about how such a conclusion could be reached. The death certificate served as a crucial piece of the prosecution's framework, essentially validating the premise that a homicide had occurred, even though the evidence for such a conclusion was incomplete. Analysts noted that once the certificate existed, the narrative shifted from questioning whether Eliza was dead to determining who was responsible for her supposed murder. This shift narrowed the investigation's focus prematurely and created the impression of factual certainty where none had been conclusively established. When the defense challenged the validity of the certificate, the appellate court upheld it by majority decision, acknowledging procedural irregularities but choosing not to overturn the ruling. only one judge dissented, warning that the issuance violated legal norms and undermined the integrity of the judicial process. His warning echoed the concerns of analysts who believed that the certificate was used as a shortcut, a way to solidify a narrative that lacked material proof. The emotional and symbolic weight of the certificate also shaped public perception. For many people following the case, the existence of an official document declaring Eliza dead made the narrative feel irrefutable. Analysts argued that this psychological impact was powerful enough to overshadow important questions about the legitimacy of the procedure. In a case already dominated by emotion, the death certificate acted as formal confirmation of a story that had never been substantiated by forensic evidence. This document influenced every subsequent stage of the case. Once Eliza was legally considered dead, alternatives such as disappearance, flight, or abduction became irrelevant in the eyes of the court. The narrative became locked into a single interpretation, and the trial proceeded as if the manner of death had been proven beyond doubt. Analysts describe this as a moment in which legal authority was used to fill the gaps left by insufficient evidence, effectively shaping the outcome of the trial before it occurred. In the years following the case, the death certificate remained a focal point of debate. For analysts, it symbolizes the tension between judicial decision-making and factual investigation, highlighting how the legal system can sometimes create realities that evidence cannot support. The document stands as a reminder of how procedural shortcuts can alter the direction of a case, leaving behind unresolved questions that continue to haunt the narrative and complicate efforts to understand what truly happened to Eliza. The story of the baby left behind after Eliza's disappearance became one of the most haunting elements of the case, not only because of the mystery surrounding what happened to her, but because of the strange and almost careless manner in which the child was moved from place to place. According to statements given during the investigation, the baby was separated from his mother and later taken to unrelated third parties in a poor community near Belo Horizonte. Analysts found it deeply unsettling that a 4-month-old child could be handed off with such ease, without documentation, oversight, or explanation. This movement reflected a chaotic lack of institutional control and raised immediate questions about the intentions of those involved. The accounts describing who had custody of the child and when were inconsistent, contradictory, and lacking in detail. Some claimed the baby remained at the property after Eliza left and never returned, while others insisted he was transported multiple times before ending up with strangers. The irregularity of these narratives made it nearly impossible to reconstruct a reliable sequence of events. Analysts emphasized that had proper child welfare procedures been followed, the authorities could have secured crucial information early in the investigation, but instead the baby's movements became yet another shadowed trail. The most perplexing aspect was the absence of a timely DNA test, which should have been the first step in understanding the nature of the conflict between Eliza and Bruno. Establishing paternity would have clarified the motivations attributed to the case, yet despite the importance of this test, it was inexplicably delayed. Analysts argued that DNA testing could have resolved key uncertainty, particularly regarding Bruno's responsibility and the legitimacy of claims surrounding financial or emotional motive. Its omission became one of the investigation's most significant gaps. Bruno later insisted he wanted the DNA test and was denied the opportunity by both family members and the judicial system. Analysts found this claim strange because paternity testing is a standard legal procedure, especially in cases involving child welfare and criminal allegations. If he genuinely sought the test, it could have altered the direction of the investigation completely. The fact that such a critical clarification was never obtained left the case anchored in assumptions that could have been resolved scientifically. When Eliza's mother eventually received the baby, she was forced to identify him not through official documentation or scientific verification, but through intuition and emotional recognition. Analysts found it tragic that such a serious matter relied solely on maternal instinct rather than objective evidence. The lack of procedural structure in this moment reflected the broader failures surrounding the case, where emotional reactions substituted formal investigation and critical opportunities for clarity were lost. As the child grew older, he became a living reminder of a story built on uncertainty. His presence symbolized both the tragedy of his mother's disappearance and the failures of the system meant to protect them. The unresolved questions about his early custody, The absence of proper legal procedures and the mystery of his mother's fate formed a haunting legacy. Analysts argued that the treatment of the child revealed as much about the flaws of the investigation as any other part of the case, highlighting a pattern of neglect, inconsistency, and systemic oversight that left the truth buried beneath unanswered questions. As the investigation progressed, the narrative surrounding the case began to take precedence over the evidence, creating a dangerous imbalance that analysts later described as one of the investigation's most significant flaws. The emotional pressure of the case, amplified by the involvement of a national football star and the disappearance of a young mother, generated a public demand for answers that investigators struggled to satisfy. Instead of allowing the inquiry to unfold based on forensic facts, authorities increasingly leaned on the narrative crafted through inconsistent testimony, particularly those of Bruno's cousin, whose shifting versions of events created a distorted picture that hardened into a presumed truth. Each time the cousin changed his story, investigators attempted to weave the new details into the narrative, rather than questioning the validity of his statement. Analysts noted that this approach reflected confirmation bias, where investigators favored information that aligned with their preconceived conclusions. Instead of challenging contradictions or inconsistencies, they molded the narrative to accommodate them, creating a version of events that relied more on adaptation than verification. This process further weakened the investigation's structural integrity and created an unstable foundation for the case. The role of the media deepened this issue, as dramatic reenactments and sensational headlines shaped public opinion long before the case reached court. These portrayals blurred the line between fact and fiction, making it difficult for viewers to distinguish between what was proven and what was speculative. Analysts emphasized that in such an emotionally charged environment, people tend to accept vivid imagery and confident narration more readily than complex forensic details. As a result, the public's understanding of the case became anchored in dramatic storytelling rather than factual evidence. The pressure created by this public perception influenced investigators, making it increasingly difficult to acknowledge doubts or uncertainties. Analysts argued that when a narrative becomes entrenched in national consciousness, admitting flaws becomes nearly impossible without risking public backlash. This pressure may have caused investigators to prioritize maintaining narrative momentum over pursuing objective analysis, reinforcing early assumptions even as contradictions accumulated. As time passed, the testimonies that formed the backbone of the case became increasingly fragile. Analysts observed that the lack of independent witnesses, the absence of material evidence, and the dependence on individuals with personal motives created a scenario where the truth was obscured by layers of speculation. Yet despite these weaknesses, the narrative persisted because it had become emotionally satisfying, providing a sense of closure even in the absence of certainty. The result was an investigation shaped more by storytelling than science. Each new detail offered by inconsistent sources was treated as another piece of a puzzle that investigators assumed must fit together somehow, even if the shapes of the pieces did not align. Analysts later described the case as an example of how narrative momentum can overpower factual rigor. In a story filled with shadows, the truth became increasingly difficult to separate from the fiction created by emotional pressure, media dramatization, and institutional bias. The investigation's lack of coordination between Rio de Janeiro and Minas Gerais became a defining flaw, creating gaps that analysts later described as impossible to close. Because Eliza was last verifiably seen in Rio but allegedly disappeared in Minas, two different jurisdictions were responsible for distinct parts of the case. Analysts emphasized that in high-profile investigation, unified command is essential to maintain consistency. But here, the two police departments operated independently, resulting in mismatched timelines, contradictory witness statements, and missed opportunities to gather evidence that might have clarified key uncertainties. Witness statements collected in Rio often conflicted with those taken in Minas. Yet instead of examining these discrepancies, investigators treated the narratives as if they were interchangeable. Analysts argued that failing to explore these contradictions created a fractured chain of information, where gaps were smoothed over rather than addressed. This lack of cohesion weakened the ability to reconstruct an accurate timeline, making every sequence of events vulnerable to speculation and subjective interpretation. The physical distance between the two states further complicated the investigation. Surveillance footage from the hotel in Rio, the condition of the vehicle, and the early stages of the journey should have been examined with meticulous care. But analysts later noted that not all evidence was reviewed with equal rigor. Some leads were pursued aggressively, while others were neglected or forgotten entirely. In Minas, search efforts focused heavily on Bruno's property. Yet without a unified investigative strategy, these searches lacked the context needed to fully understand their significance. Timing also played a critical role. Several key areas were searched days or weeks after events were alleged to have occurred, reducing the likelihood of finding meaningful forensic evidence. Analysts argued that if authorities had secured these locations earlier, the investigation might have produced clearer results. Instead, delays allowed evidence to degrade, be contaminated, or disappear entirely, leaving investigators with little more than testimony to rely on. Communication issues between departments contributed to the overall confusion. Reports were inconsistent, incomplete, or transferred without proper verification, resulting in conflicting interpretations of crucial details. Analysts pointed out that these procedural weaknesses created conditions in which misunderstandings could thrive, making it easier for unreliable narratives to gain traction. Without a centralized command structure, the investigation lacked coherence, allowing contradictions to accumulate unchecked. Ultimately, the lack of coordination between jurisdictions created a fractured narrative that made it nearly impossible to determine what truly happened to Eliza. Analysts concluded that this failure represented not just a lapse in procedure, but a deeper systemic problem. In a case already clouded by emotional intensity, media pressure, and minimal physical evidence, the absence of unified investigative oversight amplified every weakness. What remained was a story pieced together from fragments scattered across two states, a narrative shaped more by gaps than by facts. The question of motive became another central point of uncertainty in the case, as the narrative presented by the prosecution did not align neatly with the available facts. They argued that Bruno orchestrated Eliza's disappearance to avoid the financial responsibility of child support, yet analysts pointed out that his income as a successful professional goalkeeper made such a motive unlikely. With a comfortable salary and significant public standing, the idea that he would risk everything, career, reputation, and freedom, over a financial obligation that he could easily meet, raised immediate concerns about the plausibility of the prosecution's theory. Furthermore, Bruno publicly stated that he was willing to take a DNA test to confirm paternity, and if proven to be the father, to fulfill any legal responsibilities associated with the child. Analysts noted that this willingness directly contradicted the notion that he was desperate to avoid child support at all costs. If his primary motive had been financial, he would have had simpler, legal options rather than any action that would lead to severe consequences. This contradiction weakened the prosecution's argument and emphasized the uncertainty surrounding the true motives behind Eliza's disappearance. The nature of Bruno's relationship with Eliza added another layer of complexity. Their involvement was brief, inconsistent, and marked by conflicting expectations. But analysts observed that this dynamic did not necessarily suggest a motive strong enough for a violent crime. Without evidence of escalating conflict or intense emotional tension, analysts questioned whether the alleged motive was grounded in fact or constructed to fill a narrative gap. The absence of corroborating evidence made it difficult to support the idea that Bruno acted out of a deep personal or emotional drive. Another critical point was the unresolved question of the child's paternity. Since no timely DNA test was conducted, the prosecution's motive relied heavily on an assumption rather than a verified fact. Analysts argued that without confirmation that Bruno was indeed the father, the motive became even more speculative. Relying on unverified assumptions to explain a potential homicide raised concerns about the stability of the prosecution's narrative and highlighted the need for scientific clarification. Bruno's public status also complicated interpretations of motive. As a high-profile athlete at the peak of his career, with national visibility and opportunities for advancement, analysts questioned why he would jeopardize everything over a situation that could be resolved legally. His professional responsibilities and public image suggested he had far more to lose than to gain by engaging in behavior that would invite scandal. This contradiction cast further doubt on whether the alleged motive aligned with his circumstances. Ultimately, analysts concluded that the motive presented by the prosecution lacked the clarity and coherence expected in a case of such magnitude. Without verified paternity, without financial desperation, and without evidence of escalating emotional conflict, the motive remained speculative. Its fragility highlighted a deeper issue in the case. The narrative was constructed on assumptions rather than forensic certainty. As a result, the question of why Eliza disappeared remains one of the most profound and unresolved mysteries surrounding the case. The institutional failures that preceded Eliza's disappearance formed one of the most disturbing layers of the case, particularly the moment when she sought legal protection after being assaulted by Macaron during her pregnancy. Instead of receiving the protective measures she desperately needed, her request was denied by a judge who argued that her relationship with Bruno did not qualify for formal protection. Analysts later described this decision as profoundly misguided, as it prioritized personal judgment over objective legal responsibility. By dismissing her plea, the justice system left her exposed at a time of extreme vulnerability. This refusal had a devastating ripple effect. If Eliza had been granted protective status, authorities would have been obligated to monitor her safety, document threats, and intervene when necessary. Analysts emphasized that such oversight could have altered the course of events entirely. Instead, the system's failure to recognize her as a victim legitimized the dangers she was facing and removed the safeguards that might have prevented her disappearance. The implications of this decision became painfully apparent as the investigation unfolded. The institutional neglect extended into how Eliza was portrayed after she disappeared. Instead of focusing on her attempts to seek help or the violence she reported, the media often highlighted controversies from her past, framing her in a negative light that influenced public opinion. Analysts argued that this portrayal reflected a broader cultural bias, in which women, especially those outside traditional relationship structures, are judged more harshly and granted less credibility. This bias may have influenced how investigators approached the case, diminishing the urgency with which her disappearance should have been handled. Furthermore, authorities failed to connect the documented violence she experienced to the events that followed. Analysts insist that any investigation involving a victim who recently reported assault should treat that report as a critical lead, particularly when the same individuals remain in her proximity. Yet in this case, the earlier violence was mentioned, but never fully integrated into the investigative framework. This oversight weakened the ability to construct a clear picture of risk and motive, diminishing the value of one of the most important clues available. The institutional disregard for Eliza's vulnerability reflected a deeper systemic problem. Analysts noted that women who face violence often encounter skepticism when seeking help, especially when their relationships do not fit conventional expectations. Eliza's experience exemplified this issue, as her plea for protection was not evaluated based on law or risk, but on personal judgment regarding her social circumstances. This bias created an environment in which her disappearance was not treated with the urgency or seriousness required. In the aftermath of the case, analysts viewed the denial of protection and subsequent investigative failures as a tragic chain of neglect that left Eliza unprotected, unheard, and ultimately lost. These systemic shortcomings contributed to the opacity surrounding her fate and reinforced the haunting sense that the institutions meant to safeguard her instead allowed her to disappear into silence. The consequences of these failures remain a stark reminder of how institutional bias can shape the trajectory of a case long before investigators begin searching for answers. As the investigation advanced, the emotional weight surrounding Eliza's disappearance grew heavier, especially as each new testimony offered by those connected to Bruno introduced contradictions that investigators failed to reconcile. Every statement about her final days seemed to shift in subtle but significant ways, creating a network of inconsistencies that analysts later described as almost impossible to untangle. Instead of establishing clarity, these testimonies only deepened the mystery, as if the truth had splintered into multiple versions, each shaped by the fears, loyalties, or motives of the people giving them. The more these stories diverged, the more apparent it became that no single narrative could be trusted without scrutiny. Investigators, however, appeared reluctant to confront the contradictions directly. Rather than pressing witnesses on why their accounts changed or conflicted with one another, authorities often accepted the version that best aligned with the narrative they were already building. Analysts pointed out that this approach reflected an unsettling willingness to overlook discrepancies that should have triggered deeper investigation. By smoothing over conflicting details instead of interrogating them, investigators reinforced a narrative built on fragile foundations and overlooked opportunities to uncover the truth hidden between the inconsistency. The emotional atmosphere surrounding the case played a significant role in how these contradictions were treated. The public was deeply invested in the story, reacting intensely to every new development, regardless of its reliability. Media outlets amplified testimonies without questioning their validity, transforming each new detail into a dramatic revelation that shaped the nation's understanding of the case. Analysts later argued that this emotional climate created pressure to maintain the momentum of the narrative, making investigators hesitant to disrupt the story the public had already embraced, even if that story was riddled with uncertainty. At the same time, the lack of independent witnesses meant that nearly all crucial details depended on individuals whose credibility was compromised by their involvement. Everyone who claimed to have seen or interacted with Eliza after she left the hotel was directly tied to Bruno, creating a closed circle of testimony that lacked external verification. Analysts stressed that this situation made it exceptionally difficult to determine which, if any, of the statements could be trusted. Without neutral observers, the investigation became a maze of claims that reflected personal versions rather than objective truth. The contradictions extended not only to what happened, but when it happened. Timelines shifted, hours changed, and sequences became blurred. Analysts noted that without a consistent chronology, reconstructing events with accuracy became nearly impossible. Every alteration in the timeline introduced new questions and undermined earlier assumptions, creating a ripple effect that destabilized the entire narrative. Yet despite these shifting details, the investigation continued to move forward, as though the underlying story had been confirmed, ignoring the structural instability created by these conflicting accounts. Over time, the accumulation of contradictions transformed the case into a narrative dominated by shadows rather than fact. Without physical evidence to anchor the story, and without consistent testimony to guide the investigation, the truth became increasingly obscured. Analysts later described this stage of the case as one in which the disappearance of Eliza was no longer simply a mystery. It had become a void filled with competing stories, each incomplete, each uncertain, and none capable of illuminating what truly happened in those final hours. The instability of these narratives continues to haunt the case, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. As investigators continued their work, a troubling pattern became more visible. The narrative surrounding the case was no longer shaped by evidence, but by emotional pressure and public expectation. Analysts observed that key conclusions were presented with confidence before they had been supported by verifiable proof, as if the story itself had gained a momentum that the investigation felt compelled to follow. This inversion, where the narrative leads the evidence rather than the evidence leading the narrative, created an atmosphere in which doubts were dismissed and uncertainties ignored. The investigation appeared driven not by the pursuit of truth, but by a need to deliver answers that matched the dramatic storyline the country had already embraced. The reliance on testimony over physical evidence exemplified this shift. The most significant claims came from individuals whose accounts were inconsistent or self-interested. Yet these testimonies were repeatedly used to reinforce the same narrative. Analysts noted that this approach revealed the presence of confirmation bias, where investigators prioritized information that supported their assumptions while disregarding anything that challenged them. Instead of asking why testimonies conflicted, authorities attempted to weave these contradictions together into a coherent story. Even when doing so strained logic. This approach created an investigative structure more theatrical than factual. Media influence amplified this dynamic further, as reenactments and dramatic portrayals blurred the lines between storytelling and reporting. Scenes that had no forensic confirmation were broadcast as if they were factual reconstructions, shaping public memory in ways that overshadowed the uncertainties of the investigation. Analysts argued that once these dramatizations became ingrained in the national consciousness, it became nearly impossible for the investigation to diverge from the narrative that had been visually established. The emotional impact of these portrayals created a powerful illusion of certainty, even when the evidence remained ambiguous. The pressure created by this media-driven narrative placed investigators in a difficult position. Admitting doubts or revisiting earlier conclusions risked undermining public confidence, leading to backlash or accusations of incompetence. Analysts suggested that this pressure may have compelled authorities to continue down a path that felt increasingly predetermined, even as contradictions accumulated. The investigation began to take on the qualities of a story that had to reach its expected ending, rather than one grounded in the pursuit of truth. This environment also influenced how those involved in the case behaved. Individuals may have shaped their statements based on what they believed investigators wanted to hear, consciously or unconsciously reinforcing the dominant narrative. Analysts noted that in emotionally charged cases, witness statements can become entangled with cultural expectations, personal fears, or public pressures. As these influences grew, distinguishing between genuine recollections and statements shaped by external forces became even more difficult. Over time, the narrative's power overshadowed the investigation itself. Analysts concluded that the story had become so widely accepted that it no longer required verification, transforming speculation into perceived fact. This dynamic allowed uncertainties to be buried beneath a storyline that felt complete, even though critical questions remained unresolved. The dissonance between narrative and evidence became a defining characteristic of the case, deepening the mystery of what truly happened to Eliza, and leaving behind a legacy of doubt that persists to this day. As investigators continued their work, a troubling pattern became more visible. The narrative surrounding the case was no longer shaped by evidence, but by emotional pressure and public expectation. Analysts observed that key conclusions were presented with confidence before they had been supported by verifiable proof, as if the story itself had gained a momentum that the investigation felt compelled to follow. This inversion, where the narrative leads the evidence rather than the evidence leading the narrative, created an atmosphere in which doubts were dismissed and uncertainties ignored. The investigation appeared driven not by the pursuit of truth, but by a need to deliver answers that matched the dramatic storyline the country had already embraced. The reliance on testimony over physical evidence exemplified this shift. The most significant claims came from individuals whose accounts were inconsistent or self-interested, yet these testimonies were repeatedly used to reinforce the same narrative. Analysts noted that this approach revealed the presence of confirmation bias, where investigators prioritized information that supported their assumptions while disregarding anything that challenged them. Instead of asking why testimonies conflicted, authorities attempted to weave these contradictions together into a coherent story, even when doing so strained logic. This approach created an investigative structure more theatrical than factual. Media influence amplified this dynamic further, as reenactments and dramatic portrayals blurred the lines between storytelling and reporting. Scenes that had no forensic confirmation were broadcast as if they were factual reconstructions, shaping public memory in ways that overshadowed the uncertainties of the investigation. Analysts argued that once these dramatizations became ingrained in the national consciousness, it became nearly impossible for the investigation to diverge from the narrative that had been visually established. The emotional impact of these portrayals created a powerful illusion of certainty, even when the evidence remained ambiguous. The pressure created by this media-driven narrative placed investigators in a difficult position. Admitting doubts or revisiting earlier conclusions risked undermining public confidence, leading to backlash or accusations of incompetence. Analysts suggested that this pressure may have compelled authorities to continue down a path that felt increasingly predetermined. Even as contradictions accumulated, the investigation began to take on the qualities of a story that had to reach its expected ending, rather than one grounded in the pursuit of truth. This environment also influenced how those involved in the case behaved. Individuals may have shaped their statements based on what they believed investigators wanted to hear, consciously or unconsciously reinforcing the dominant narrative. Analysts noted that in emotionally charged cases, witness statements can become entangled with cultural expectations, personal fears, or public pressures. As these influences grew, distinguishing between genuine recollections and statements shaped by external forces became even more difficult. Over time, the narrative's power overshadowed the investigation itself. Analysts concluded that the story had become so widely accepted that it no longer required verification, transforming speculation into perceived fact. This dynamic allowed uncertainties to be buried beneath a storyline that felt complete, even though critical questions remained unresolved. The dissonance between narrative and evidence became a defining characteristic of the case, deepening the mystery of what truly happened to Eliza, and leaving behind a legacy of doubt that persists to this day. The issuance of Eliza's death certificate became one of the most legally troubling decisions in the case, as it declared her dead and assigned a cause of death without a body, without forensic analysis, and without fulfilling the legal requirements for presumed death. Analysts emphasized that such a certificate can only be issued under specific circumstances, none of which applied here. The judge who signed it effectively created a legal certainty that did not exist in reality, transforming speculation into official fact. This decision altered the trajectory of the case, embedding an assumption of homicide into the judicial process long before evidence had been established. The most alarming detail on the certificate was the specified cause of death: asphyxiation. Without a body, without medical examination, and without physical proof, determining the method of death was impossible. Analysts questioned how such a conclusion could be reached, suggesting that it reflected reliance on unverified testimony rather than scientific evidence. By presenting an alleged method of homicide as official fact, the certificate reinforced a narrative that had never been supported by forensic finding, creating a judicial reality out of conjecture. When the defense challenged the certificate's validity, the appellate court upheld it by majority decision, acknowledging irregularities but choosing not to correct them. Only one judge dissented, warning that the issuance violated legal norms and jeopardized the integrity of the judicial process. Analysts echoed his concerns, arguing that the certificate acted as a procedural shortcut that allowed the jury to bypass the fundamental question of whether Eliza was dead and proceed directly to determining who was responsible. This shift placed the prosecution's narrative on firmer ground, despite the lack of supporting evidence. The emotional impact of the death certificate on the public was profound. For many, the existence of an official document declaring Eliza dead made the narrative feel irrefutable. Analysts noted that the symbolic weight of the certificate overshadowed expert critiques and created an atmosphere in which alternative interpretations became nearly impossible to consider. In a case already dominated by emotion, the document served as a powerful anchor that tied the public's understanding to a version of events presented with unjustified certainty. This premature legal closure had a direct impact on the trial. Once Eliza was officially declared dead, the court no longer needed to debate the fundamental nature of the case. The question of whether a crime had occurred was effectively resolved on paper, and the focus shifted exclusively to assigning guilt. Analysts argued that this procedural maneuver undermined the principles of due process, as the jury deliberated an alleged homicide without ever receiving proof that one had occurred. The certificate functioned as an assumption embedded into the judicial process itself. In the years that followed, analysts continued to debate the significance of the death certificate, viewing it as a symbol of the tension between legal authority and factual evidence. The document represented a moment in which narrative momentum overtook the need for verification, creating a legal fiction that shaped the outcome of the case. Its existence remains one of the most controversial aspects of the investigation, raising lasting questions about the boundaries of judicial power and the potential consequences of bypassing established legal procedure. The media's role in shaping public perception became one of the most powerful forces in the case, as dramatic reenactments, sensational headlines, and emotionally charged narratives flooded television screens across the country. Analysts observed that these portrayals blurred the lines between fact and fiction, presenting unverified testimony as visual truth. Scenes that had no forensic confirmation were recreated with actors, lighting, and music, designed to evoke fear and certainty, imprinting in viewers' minds a version of events that felt real regardless of its factual basis. This blending of entertainment and reporting created a potent narrative that overshadowed the investigation's uncertainties. Rumors that should have been dismissed, stories involving dogs, incineration, burial under concrete, and other grotesque theories, were repeatedly broadcast without verification. Analysts emphasized that many of these claims were scientifically impossible or contradicted by forensic finding, yet they remained in circulation because they made for compelling television. Each sensational detail added another layer of drama to the story, gradually shaping a collective memory built not on evidence, but on emotional impact. The repetition of these unverified elements created a sense of inevitability around the narrative, even when facts failed to support it. The media's framing of Eliza contributed to this distortion as well. Instead of focusing on her documented attempts to seek protection or the violence she reported, coverage often highlighted controversial aspects of her past, subtly shifting public perception of her character. Analysts argued that this portrayal reflected societal biases that judge women more harshly, especially those who do not conform to expected relationship roles. By emphasizing these aspects, the media indirectly undermined her credibility, influencing how the public interpreted her disappearance and the motives attributed to those involved. At the same time, Bruno's celebrity status intensified the media frenzy. As a prominent football player, his fall from grace provided a narrative arc too dramatic for broadcasters to resist. Analysts pointed out that stories involving public figures often attract exaggerated attention, creating an environment where every detail becomes amplified and every rumor becomes a potential headline. This magnification of the case turned it into national drama, making it nearly impossible for investigators to escape the influence of public expectation. The saturation of sensational content created a climate in which the public accepted the dramatized narrative as fact, forming opinions before evidence had been presented in court. Analysts noted that once a story becomes embedded in public consciousness through vivid imagery and emotional storytelling, contradicting it with forensic reality becomes extremely difficult. As a result, the investigation operated under pressure from a public convinced they already understood what had happened, regardless of the evidence, or lack thereof, supporting that conclusion. Over time, the media's portrayal of the case became inseparable from the case itself. The dramatic reenactment, the sensational speculation, and the biased framing shaped the narrative so strongly that distinguishing between investigative findings and televised fiction became nearly impossible. Analysts concluded that the media constructed a version of the story that satisfied emotional curiosity more than it reflected factual truth. This narrative, repeated across countless broadcasts, became the story the nation believed, even as crucial questions remained unanswered and evidence remained absent. Bruno's transformation from celebrated goalkeeper to national villain unfolded with an intensity that analysts later described as unprecedented, driven not only by the severity of the accusations, but also by the emotional weight of his public image. At the height of his career, he stood as a symbol of success, admired by millions, and positioned as one of Flamengo's most promising athletes. When the allegations of Eliza's disappearance emerged, the contrast between his heroic persona and the darkness of the narrative created a shock that resonated deeply across the country. This abrupt shift fueled public outrage and shaped the way every subsequent detail of the case was interpreted, casting him into a role from which there was no escape. Brazil's cultural devotion to football magnified the drama in ways few cases ever experienced. In a nation where players are treated as icons and symbols of national pride, the fall of a star becomes a story too powerful to ignore. Analysts noted that this cultural backdrop intensified the emotional gravity surrounding the case, making it difficult for the public to separate the athlete from the accusations. His fame, once a source of admiration, now became a lens through which guilt seemed almost inevitable. The narrative of an idol's downfall overshadowed the complexities of the investigation, turning the case into a symbolic tragedy that audiences consumed with fervor. As the story grew, Bruno's silence further shaped the narrative, reinforcing public belief in his guilt, even though silence is a common legal strategy advised by defense attorneys. Analysts explained that in high-profile cases, any hesitation or refusal to speak is often misinterpreted as evidence of culpability. Yet in the emotional climate surrounding this case, these misinterpretations gained disproportionate strength. Public expectations for answers collided with legal caution, transforming his silence into a perceived confession that further solidified the narrative crafted by media and investigators. This intense scrutiny placed investigators under enormous pressure as the public demanded swift and definitive answers. Analysts observed that the scale of the case, magnified by Bruno's fame, created an environment in which authorities felt compelled to deliver results that matched public expectation. The need to appear decisive may have influenced the direction of the investigation, creating a momentum that pushed the narrative toward confirmation rather than examination. This pressure risked overshadowing doubts, inconsistencies, and the lack of material evidence, contributing to a process shaped as much by expectation as by fact. The portrayal of Bruno in the media became increasingly one-dimensional, reducing a complex investigation to a story with a clear villain. Television programs presented dramatic reenactments that cast him in a sinister light, transforming speculation into visual certainty. Analysts argued that these portrayals made it almost impossible for the public to consider alternative explanations, as the emotional impact of such imagery created a powerful sense of inevitability. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the narrative surrounding him had already calcified into something resembling myth, shaped more by performance than by evidence. As the trial unfolded, analysts observed that the legal proceedings seemed at times to echo the structure of a story already told. The emotional climate surrounding the case blurred the boundaries between judicial evaluation and public expectation, creating a space in which the search for truth became overshadowed by the need for resolution. In this atmosphere, Bruno's trial felt less like an inquiry into what happened and more like the final act of a tragedy that had captivated the nation for months. The tension between narrative and evidence became impossible to ignore, leaving behind a lingering sense that the outcome had been shaped as much by cultural forces as by legal ones. This unresolved tension remains one of the most haunting aspects of the entire case.